Alrighty, so starting out, we are into First and Second Kings, and then with Psalms stuck in there. They kind of put all of the Psalms that are, kind of don't have a, scholars. They try to figure out where the Psalms fit, exactly. Is like who wrote this and what. Most of them, of course, are ascribed to David, and but it's like if we don't know the situation, then it's kind of hard to put it somewhere. And so that's what they've done is they put all the Psalms that we don't really know where they go right here in this in these 2 weeks. Is what it looks like. So Kings first, right? We're going to talk about Kings first. So again, just like when we talked about 1st and 2nd Samuel, note that Kings is just one book, right? It was split later on down the road, right? So 1st and 2nd Kings is really one big book, and then later on down the road it was split. That's done again because they're, later on when you get to, your scrolls are only so long, right? And so they split them up. We talked about it a little bit last week, but when you get into the Greek translations and stuff, they split them up and they give them different names. Remember, if you will, 1 Samuel through 2 Kings, what we call those 4 books, was actually 1st through 4 reigns in the Septuagint, right? And so we've talked about that. The Septuagint being the
Greek
of the
New Testament.
Old Testament. Good. Very good. Yep. All right. So the books of Kings then, as we call them, the books of Kings, are going to take place between 970 BC at Solomon, or right there at the death of David, the end of his reign, until about 561 BC, or right at 561 BC, where you have Jehoiachin released there in 561 BC. So that's the time span. Okay. So one major point of Kings is to explain to later generations why the Israelites are exiled, right? And so note that 2 Kings 17:13 through 18, that's 2 Kings 17:13 through 18, it says, "Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers, and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But they would not listen, but were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their fathers, and the warnings that he gave them. They went after false idols and became false, and they followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them that they should not do like them. And they abandoned all the commandments of the Lord their God, and made for themselves metal images of 2 calves, and they made an Asherah, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And they burned their sons and their daughters as offerings, and used divination and omens, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger." Right? So they did many bad things. All of this has to do with false worship practices, right? Note that the 2 metal idols, which we haven't officially gotten to yet as far as in our readings, but the 2 metal idols, when you have the kingdom split, and you have Jeroboam and Rehoboam, you have the north. They set up 2 places to worship falsely, and they put idols there, and that's to keep the Israelites from going south, because it was thought that if they went south to worship at the temple, then they would stay there and they wouldn't go back north, and so it was to keep the people there. So they set up false worship places. Note, it says they burned their sons and their daughters. That would be, of course, in the worship of Chemosh or Molech. That would be the gods of Moab and the Ammonites. And so then it says, "Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only," right? And so that's referring to the northern kingdom of Israel, which was taken out in 722 BC by the Assyrians, right? All right. Note that Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20 tells us what a king should be like. Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20 says, "When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed," remember, and we did this last week, "you may indeed set a king over you whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So note again, it is assumed that they will have a king. However, it's also assumed that the king will act in accordance to Deuteronomy, which we refer to as the Book of the Covenant. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a book of copy of this law, which is Deuteronomy, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children. So note, it's assumed that there will be kings, but they're supposed to follow God, and specifically they're supposed to follow the Book of the Covenant here, which is Deuteronomy specifically, right? So when Deuteronomy is written, it's written, hey, you should keep a copy of this book in order to follow it, keep it close to your heart, and it goes through several different things that you should not do. Multiple horses, like buying up material items and things like that, multiple wives, right, and all of that. And again, why do we have multiple wives? Is it just because the kings, they just like a bunch of wives? Why do they do that? Children is one. That is a major deal, but there's another reason too. Political treaties and alliances, right? Okay, so we marry these people because, again, it was seen as, well, if I marry your daughter, then we're going to get along, right? Well, that never worked out, but they did that up and through, past medieval times and up into the, fairly modern times in the last 300 or 400 years. So note that 1 Samuel 8:10 through 18 warned us what a king would actually look like. So it says this is after they asked for a king. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking. This is 1 Samuel 8:10 through 18. Who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Right? So there's the warning. This is what a king is actually going to look like, right? And we get Saul, and he was a dud, right? Then we get David. He had his issues, but he's the ultimate king before Jesus, right? He's the template that we want a king to be like. And then we move to the kids, right? So how does Solomon do? Note that the covenant is conditioned in 1 Kings on Solomon and his line's willingness to follow God. So we think of the Davidic covenant as he gets all of this, you'll have a family line and all of that. But then in 1 Kings 2:3 through 4, it says, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word and that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Note it says if, right? If. It is conditional, right? So chapter 1, note that we have a relatively small power struggle between Solomon and Adonijah, right? Adonijah, his brother. Note that Adonijah is the older brother, and technically, according to ancient Near Eastern practice, he technically would be the person who would succeed. Then in chapter 2, you get Solomon getting instructions from David, which are, I find them humorous, but I have a warped sense of humor because he has him go back and kill all of these people that he said, I will not kill you, Shimei. I will not kill you for cursing at me as I was leaving town after Absalom was trying to kill me. And then he tells Solomon, he says, hey, that guy that I said, Shimei, I said I wouldn't kill him. Well, listen, if you would, go ahead and take care of that. And listen, David was true to his word. He did not kill him, right? He had Solomon do it. So it's like, okay. Yeah. So Solomon gets instructions from David and consolidates his power, killing any potential political dissident. Note that Shimei he's still not acting right is the reason he actually gets killed, but he's against Solomon and all of that. And then notice Joab himself. He has Joab killed, who has been his loyal commander. The problem is he backs Adonijah, right? And so listen, Joab is a great military leader, and we like to think of all these people as because it's in the Bible, and we think, well, they're better than everybody else. No, they're not. Joab, as a leader of the military, would have been a prime candidate to pull the military and say, hey, everybody come with me, and they would have all followed him because he was their commander. And so Joab had to die, and so that's basically what happened. So then what does Solomon do? The wisest of kings, right? Well, he does set up a centralized government, which is pretty cool, moving away from the loose tribal governments that they had, right? So they have all these different tribes, and within the 12 tribes, you have all these small family tribes, right? And so what he does is he consolidates everybody into one nation, which is good. And so that is a good thing. But notice that to do this, and for his building projects and such, he imposes harsh taxes, institutes slavery, and that obviously is frowned upon, right? Frowned upon. It's exactly what Solomon said God told Solomon to tell the people would happen. He does exactly that, right? And it's what splits the kingdom because his son refuses to do any better. And that's the reason they're like, hey, you got to be better than Solomon because he's pretty harsh on us, right? With the slavery and the taxes. And we'll talk about that when we get there, but that's another funny story. Where were we not supposed to go back to? What were we not supposed to be like? Egypt, right? We're not supposed to be like Egypt. Well, guess what? Solomon basically sets up his kingdom exactly like Egypt. He models his kingdom after Egypt, right? That's a big no-no. That's bad. All right, so with all of that kind of as your framework, we're going to talk about a few passages because, again, really it only got through chapter 2, right, for in our First Kings set, and I didn't want to go ahead too much, so we're going to work with what we were supposed to work with this week. So I always thought this was fascinating. Like I thought there's got to be something more to this. What is the deal? Some of you are already grinning at me, so you may know what I'm going at. David gets a young virgin to keep him warm, right? So 1 Kings 1 through 4. No, listen, remember, we're adults here, right? All right. It says, now, King David was old and advanced in years, okay? So that's important. And although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. Therefore his servant said to him, let a young woman be sought for my lord the king, and let her wait on the king and be in his service. Let her lie in your arms, that my lord the king may be warm. So they sought for a beautiful young woman throughout all the territory of Israel, and found Abishag the Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The young woman was very beautiful, and she was of service to the king and attended to him, but the king knew her not. Now, when you read that, you think, oh, he's such a gentleman. He knew her not. Okay, well, that's not what that means. okay? Notice that it starts out telling you that the king is old, right? And so a king's virility is a sign of his ability to lead and to be a good king, right? And so she is brought here to see if he's still virile, right? That's the point. He's old, he's in the bed, and we're like, okay, listen, we've got to see what we can do. And so that's the point of doing this. There are other ways that they could have kept him warm if that was the only point, right? So this is kind of a test of David to see if he's still able to perform like a king, right? Because again, he's got tons of wives at this point. And so it's not about, like he's, whatever. It is what it kind of sounds like. Note too, that directly after this, you have Adonijah attempting to make himself the king. And so that's the point, is it's like, listen, David is no longer to perform as a king at all anymore. And so therefore, people start thinking, I'm going to be the king next, right? And both Solomon and Adonijah both start vying for that place. It says at 1 Kings 1:5, it says, now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him, right? So he's like, David's not able to be the king anymore. I'm taking over, okay? Now, when that happens, and we're not going to read all of it, but when that happens, you have this interesting plot that happens. And again, you would like to think that your main characters in the Bible, particularly I think Nathan the prophet, like he's involved in all this intrigue. I just find it fascinating. They are very much like their ancient Near Eastern neighbors. And again, that's part of the problem, just for the record. So you have it, 1 Kings 1:5 through 27, you have this whole palace intrigue where Adonijah has set himself up to be the king, and then Nathan goes to Bathsheba, and they're like, hey, this is a problem. Solomon needs to be the king. And so they come up with a deal, right? Where Bathsheba's going to go in, and she's going to talk to David, and she's going to be like, hey, I thought you said Solomon was going to be the king. Gosh, Adonijah has set himself up to be the king, right? And this is to shock David and be like, wait a minute, what? I didn't approve that. And then it's Nathan's idea, right? So then Nathan comes in right after, and he's all like, hey, did you know that Adonijah has set himself up to be the king? They obviously had this all planned out, right? And it's to trick David, or I don't want to say trick David, because technically David did already previously, and at the end of 2 Samuel, he already said that Solomon was going to be the king. So this is actually what David wants, but they just have to be very careful about how they go about getting David to realize that things are not going the way it's supposed to, and we need to get on board. Then you have somewhat of an interesting deal where Adonijah, so they put Solomon up as the king, and it's clear that David has said Solomon's going to be the king, and Adonijah's got this huge party going on, right? And then somebody comes in and says, my goodness, David has said Solomon's the king, and it's a party for Adonijah to be the king. And so they're all like, we shouldn't be here because we're all going to end up dead, right? So they all leave because they don't want to be associated anymore with Adonijah, and so they get out, right? So and then he goes to David, and he's like, Solomon, he's like, please don't kill me. And Solomon's like, well, as long as you play your cards right, I'm not going to kill you. And then, spoiler alert, he kills him later on down the road, right? He didn't play his cards right. All right. Interestingly, throughout the Old Testament, in different places, you have, such as in 1 Chronicles 29, 26 through 30. You don't have to go there. I'm not going to read the actual passage. But you have different places where it says, as it is written in the books of the kings of Judah or whatever, right? And there are several, and I don't even remember what they all are right there, but there's several different sources that are listed there that obviously we don't have, right? And so that's pretty interesting, because what you find is these books, for instance, the books of Kings are written considerably later on, obviously after all the kings, right? And so what did we say? 530, 561, right? When I think it's 561 is the last thing that happens. And so clearly after that is, when these books are written. But what you have is you have people writing down this information and stuff in different books, if you will, right? And so they keep notes on all of these things that are going on. And then at some point in time, someone compiled all of this information into what we call 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, right? And so all of that's compiled. So when you see those little places, that's the sources that the author used to write those books, right? And so it's kind of an interesting thing. I mean, it would be fascinating if somebody came across some of these books, right? It's like in the New Testament, right? What we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians seems actually to be 2nd and 3rd Corinthians. There's apparently a 1st Corinthians that we don't know about, because in what we call 1st Corinthians, Paul refers back to the previous letter. Well, we don't have that previous letter, right? So what if suddenly they found this previous letter? Now, it would be hard to go back and say that it was, that it was legitimate or whatever, but it could be interesting. Just as an aside, whenever you see on the Discovery Channel, you see, banned from the Bible, and the Gospel of Judas and all of these different books, and they're like, why were these taken out of the Bible, right? Well, first of all, they're not taken out of the Bible. They were never included in the Bible, and there's very good reasons that those books aren't included in the Bible. One, they're written way later than the actual time period. They're not associated at all with an apostle or anybody who knew Jesus. And in most cases, well, I would say in all cases of those books, their theology or the other information that they give is totally different than what the Gospels say, right? So if you look at one of those books and it goes against what the Gospels say, then that's a problem. So for instance, in the Gospel of Judas, that's one of the later ones that was found. In the Gospel of Judas, Judas is the good guy, right? Jesus goes to Judas and he's like, hey, listen, you're my best friend, right? You're the best of my disciples. I need you to do me a favor. And Judas is all like, oh, yes, Lord, I gladly I will do you this favor. And he says, I need you to betray me so that I can get myself crucified, so that I can then be resurrected from the dead and all of that, right? And so then Judas is all like, okay, I'll do that. And then that's what he does. And then he looks like the bad guy when he's really the good guy, all that. Well, listen, the Gospels that we have that we consider authoritative, they clearly don't say that. And so that's your first clue. Like, wait a minute, that can't be because of, they go against what we have as authoritative. Now, there are other problems with those books, and particularly the Gospel of Judas, but that's the way you look at those things. It's generally, you look at, was it written in the time of within, that first century? Was it written with someone who was at least associated with an apostle? And then does its theology go against anything that we already know is authoritative, right? And in the case of the Gospel of Judas, it has all of those problems. Every one of those problems is an issue. All right, so you do get that in the Old Testament. We don't have any of those sources, but it is interesting to think about. All right. So introduction to the Psalms. Okay, so I'm going to go over a little bit about the Psalms. So the word that we get Psalms comes from a Greek word, psalmoi, which comes from a verb in Greek also, that's psallion, which means in this context to sing accompanied by a harp or lyre. Literally, the word means to pluck strings, okay? And since it's written out words, then what we're saying is this is a song meant to be sang while there is an accompaniment, right? And so, again, and I'm not against, Church of Christ or whatever. I've got close friends that are Church of Christ. But, that's one of their things is that you should not use musical instruments in worship. And the reason that they argue that is because they'll say, well, there's no place in the New Testament that has instruments in the worship of God. And so I always say, well, in the Old Testament, clearly you have instruments in the worship of God, right? And then in the book of Revelation, you have instruments. Again, it's obviously symbolic, but you have the worship of God at his throne with musical instruments. So I'm thinking if God's okay with it in the Old Testament, and he's okay with it being spoken of in the book of Revelation before his throne, then he's good with it. But then again, what we're arguing is that then therefore you would not be able to do the Psalms the way they're meant to be performed without instruments, because it literally means to be plucked, right? So there's just kind of an argument that I would throw out there. There are 150 Psalms. Note that you might hear of the 151st Psalm. That Psalm is in your Catholic Bibles, in the Apocrypha. And that Psalm is a Psalm of David about his victory against Goliath. The reason that it's there is because, again, it's in the Septuagint, but it's not in any of the Hebrew and such that we have. And so that's an added Psalm that they have in the Apocrypha, but that obviously as Protestants we do not have in our Bibles. You have many different genres of Psalms. You have hymns, which are songs of praise. You have Psalms of Yahweh's enthronement, which they basically celebrate the kingship of Yahweh. You have Psalms of individual and communal complaints, where you have, like, for instance, when David's talking about all these people are against me and, I need help and all of those things. That's an example. You have Psalms of individual and communal thanksgiving, right, where people are giving thanks or the community is giving thanks. You have royal Psalms, which deal with earthly kingship. And then you have wisdom Psalms, which are meant for teaching and such as that. So now, what did I decide to do with the Psalms? I'm going to go through every Psalm and explain every word. No, I'm not going to do that. All the ones that they did. I did only go through the ones that they have listed, and then I picked from those. So we may skip some Psalms. So if you say, well, wait, why didn't we do Psalm, whatever, that we seem to have skipped? Well, it may be because it's later on down the road. So what did I choose to do? I chose to pick Psalms that echo the Messiah, right? And so I think those are important because that's going to, when we get to the New Testament and we read allusions to the Psalms in regards to the Messiah, that's going to be an important thing, right? So I wanted to go through and do that, take this opportunity to do that. So note that Jesus himself sees himself in the Old Testament, right? So at Luke 24:44, it's just one verse. You don't have to try to turn there if you don't want. It says, "Then he said to them, 'These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled.'" And so Jesus clearly understands that the Old Testament is written, much of it is written about him, right? It's interesting. I had to do a book review in seminary, and it was by a good Christian Bible scholar and generally conservative. But in this review, that I did, I pointed out that he said that Jesus did not know who he was until he read the Old Testament, and then as he read the Old Testament, he realized that that's who he was. And I'm like, that seems a little disconcerting. Like, Jesus had no idea until he suddenly read the Old Testament. He's like, hey, I sound like that, right? Yeah, I don't think that's not the case, right? And so I wrote that, and my professor actually wrote back when he graded the paper. He said, I'm thankful that someone had a problem with that, right? And so it's not that, but he's making the point that the Old Testament in many places points to him. Now, we often hear said that the entire Old Testament points to Jesus, okay? I'm just going to say I disagree with that, right? I disagree. Obviously, there's much from the Old Testament that points to Jesus, right? But the Old Testament was written to those people in that day about things that they were dealing with, right? Now, there are certainly promises of the Messiah and all of that. There's many places about Jesus in there as far as, prophecies of a later Davidic king and all of that. There are places that allude to to someone who will come in and redeem us like Jesus. But there's a lot of other stuff that only pertains to those people. Now, if you wanted to say all of those places where it's talking about, that they're going to be punished and all this, that all looks forward to a time when, all of our sins will be forgiven through Jesus. I mean, you can do that, but technically those words are written to those people about sins that they're committing, and they're not going to have that opportunity right then, right? They're not going to have that opportunity to have Jesus. So I think we have to be careful when we say that the entire Old Testament, like some of it, deals with bodily fluids and stuff. And so that stuff doesn't have anything to do with Jesus, generally, right? So we have to be careful how we throw that out there. Okay, so Psalm 8, right? Psalm 8 at 8:2, it says, out of the mouth of babies and infants, you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger, right? So out of the mouth of babies and infants, you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. So the original point is that God can use even the weakest in society to make something great and have his name praised. That's actually one of the more complicated ones that we're going to go over because there's some grammatical issues about exactly what that says and what that means. But note that in Matthew 21:15 through 16, it says, but when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, Jesus of course, and the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were indignant. And they said to him, do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes, have you never heard, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise. So Jesus quotes that passage and refers it to himself, right? And so again, the point being is that those children are being used for a great moment where they get to praise Jesus who is coming and who is going to offer something fantastic. So basically these children are involved in something fantastic. So he's like, why would I hush them when they're proclaiming my name, right? 8:6, Psalm 8:6 says, you have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. Now, the original context of Psalm 8:6 is talking about the king, the earthly king, right? But then Hebrews 2:8 refers that to Jesus as the ultimate Davidic king who fulfills all of what the Davidic kings were supposed to be like. It says, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now, in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, right? Because that's, of course, looking forward to the time when Jesus has his earthly reign, right? When the new heavens and the new earth come together, Jesus reigns on earth. And then at that point, we will see fully everything under his dominion. I guess at this point, it might be kind of hard to see, particularly when the author of Hebrews is writing and he sees the Roman Empire, who seems to be in control. But of course, the book of Revelation makes the point, no, the Roman Empire is not in control. God is still in control. It just seems like that, right? And so at this later time. But again, the author of Hebrews goes back and refers that to Jesus. All right, we have several in Psalm. I think you have brought up Psalm 22. Psalm 22, you have several passages that are used in the New Testament. So I'm going to kind of go through them in this section and then we'll talk about it. So first at Psalm 22:1, it says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? And then skip to 7:8, it says, all who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. And then jump to 16 through 18. It says, for dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Okay, so again, this is going to be a psalm about a Davidic king, okay, in its original context. It conveys a harsh sense of anguish at the persecution surrounding the author, right? Seemingly David. Would seem that would be David when he's at his lowest and you have all these things happen. Think of Shimei, right? The part that you have to understand, though, is in this psalm, even though he talks about all of this anguish, I think it's, I didn't write it here, but I think verses 21 through, I think it may go to 30. At that point, it shows that he continues to trust in God to rescue him. Even though he's being persecuted, he still trusts in God, and he understands that God is going to rescue him, right? So then you get to Matthew 27:46, and it says this is at Jesus' crucifixion. It says, about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, lema sabachthani, right? And it says, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me, right? And so you look at that, and that should cause you concern. It should cause you a moment, be like, wait a minute, what is going on here? Note interestingly, before I explain it, that the original is in Hebrew. Jesus speaks Aramaic here. This is the Aramaic version of the saying. And then when it says, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's in Greek in the original. And so when we talk about the biblical languages and we say that the biblical languages are Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, you have all three of them, taken up right here. And again, I will tell you very quickly, the reason that is once the Israelites go into exile after, 722 under Assyria, 586 under the Babylonians, the language of both of those empires is Aramaic. So you have Hebrew people speaking Hebrew who are then exiled into these places that speak Aramaic. They then start speaking Aramaic. That becomes the language of the Hebrew people. Then you have in 332 BC, you have Alexander the Great comes in. He spreads Greek culture. And so then you have the language of people becoming Greek. So by the time you get to the New Testament period, you have Jesus, who would certainly be familiar with Hebrew. He reads the Isaiah scroll at one point, right? So that would have been in Hebrew. But his language at home, if you will, would have been Aramaic. That's the language he would have spoken. And then as he is a tecton, which is a tecton is not just a carpenter, that's kind of a misnomer. A tecton is basically a construction worker, right? Like he would have dealt in stone and wood and all kinds of different things. He would have spoken Greek, right? And so you have all of those languages situated right there, interestingly together, I always thought. Okay. So when you read that and you say, well, man, Jesus is speaking out in this anguish that God has forsaken him, and man, God has forsaken him and all of that. But what you have to realize is when Jesus has that in mind and he says that on the cross, he's thinking the context of that entire psalm. And anyone hearing him who's Jewish would have absolutely understood the context of that psalm as well. So you have to take the whole thing in context, right, which is my favorite thing, in context, and understand that Jesus absolutely understood that God was going to rescue him, right? He has to go through all of this suffering, and Jesus didn't want to go through the suffering, right? At Gethsemane, he says, hey, if you can take this cup from me, that would be great. But then what does he say? He says, but your will be done, right? So he understands things are about to get really bad for me, and I don't want to do that. However, the will of God is the most important thing. So it's a similar deal here. He is saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? However, you have to follow the whole line of thought where he understands that God is going to rescue him. Now, he's going to be rescued when he's resurrected and, raises to the right hand of God. But so he still has to go through it. Note, David, assuming it's about David in its original context, he also went through all of the bad stuff. I mean, he went through horrible stuff, right? So similar kind of thing. So when you see that, it's not as striking as it seems, like, necessarily that God, it's not, and I know we say that, God had to turn on the sin and all that, and I don't have a problem with that, but the point there is simply that he understands the full context, and that's what people would have understood as he said that. Okay. Note, and I didn't put it all in there, but note that, of course, the Roman soldiers, they cast lot for his clothes, and so that fulfills ultimately that part. His bones are not broken, which I think that actually is in a later part, or it may be one that wasn't in this time. I think it's actually coming up. All right, Psalm 35. So you got Psalm 35:11, which says, malicious witnesses rise up. They ask me of things that I do not know. And then you have Mark 14:57, and it says, and some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, and it talks about the false witness. So you have that whole idea of false witness. Then you have that Psalm 35:19. So this is shortly thereafter. Let not those rejoice over me who are wrongfully my foes, and let not those wink the eye who hate me without cause. Again, this is going to be about a Davidic king in its original context. And then John 15:25 says, but the word that is written in their law must be fulfilled. They hated me without cause. And so John uses that phrase to point back and say, listen, this is how it's like, right? This is what the Davidic king is going to be like. And it's ultimately about Jesus. And so look, you have to remember, we can have what we call a near fulfillment, but then you can have a far fulfillment too. So when you see these fulfillments, sometimes you will even see, like there's a verse in Hosea, I think it's Hosea 10:1, that's used in a very different way in Paul. And I shouldn't even brought it up because I don't remember the reference. But we have New Testament authors who will reinterpret Old Testament passages to fit what they need to say, right? That's just the way Jewish people wrote. But you can also have Old Testament fulfillment of these Old Testament passages, but then they can have their ultimate far fulfillment in Jesus, right? And so that's okay. Some people will say, well, that's clearly, well, in all fairness, the Jewish people, they'll say, well, that clearly was fulfilled in that time. Maybe, yes. But ultimately, we can look at its fulfillment in the New Testament times, and clearly John sees that as that ultimate fulfillment, right? It's not denying an Old Testament fulfillment. It's just saying it can have both. And it puts Jesus in that situation where where John's making that argument, that Jesus is the ultimate Davidic king who suffers, right? And so that's the point. All right, Psalm 40, 6 through 8. It says, in sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart, right? And so the people of the time, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. Sacrifices don't mean anything if your heart's not right. You could slaughter as many goats and cows and whatever else, but if your heart's not right, you're not doing anything. It's like if you're a millionaire, right? And you're like, hey, you know what? I'm gonna give a bunch of money to the church, so they'll put my name maybe on a building or something, and because that's important. And but I'm not gonna do any of the actual stuff because I don't need to do that because I'm paying my money, right? Well, you could give $1 billion to this church, but and it would be hard, obviously, to But yeah, they'll take your money and pray for you. I asked Russ one time. I was installing a car stereo for one of his cars, and I said, hey, just for the record, I said, if I won the lottery, would you take my money as a tithe? And he said, yeah. He said, Adrian Rogers always said it's okay to take money from fools.
Brother John told me one time the devil's had that money long enough.
Yeah. I'm not saying I play the lottery. I'm just saying it was a rhetorical question. All right. It's hot in here, man. No, I'm just kidding. All right, the scroll of the book refers to Deuteronomy that's mentioned there. Note that Deuteronomy 17, 18 through 19 says, and when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a book a copy of this law, which we talked about earlier, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them. So note that the psalmist there is saying, the law is in my heart. In other words, I'm going to do the law because it's in my heart. That's the ultimate goal there. So then you get to Hebrews 10, 5 through 7, and it says, consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body have you prepared for me. Notice it says body as opposed to opening of the ears. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. So the author of Hebrews is saying that Jesus had the law written on his heart, right? And so that's the point. He lives the law because it's internalized in him, right? It's like if somebody asked you to do the right thing, right? And then you have to get out your Bible and scroll through and be like, I don't know, what does the Bible say about that, right? I assume that most of you, in general cases, when it comes for you to do the right thing, you have read the Bible enough to know it just pops in your head. Yes, I would do the right thing because of blah, 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 whatever, right? Or you don't even think about that at all. You just do the right thing, right? Well, that's Jesus. Jesus does the right thing all the time. It's written on his heart. So you don't have to think about it. You just do the right thing. And of course, as Christians, obviously we're not Jesus. So that's part of that sanctification process that Paul talks about. You're justified, which means you're saved. And then you begin the process of sanctification, right? Where you become a better Christian. You become more and more Christ-like every day, right? And a lot of that has to do with Bible study. A lot of that has to do with praying and being, with God and all of that. But Jesus had that law written on his heart. Notice that the use of body there as opposed to ears follows the Greek. So that's the way it is in the Greek. So you have the Hebrew, which says open ears. You have the Septuagint, which has body. And so the author of Hebrews, again, because his Bible is the Greek Septuagint, and so he uses the Greek, which also, of course, follows along better with the context here, and it's Jesus' body, which is the important thing, because he embodies that. Psalm 41. Psalm 41:9 says, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. And again, that's going to be David, right? Dealing with people around him who are going against him because he's, his son is taking his place. That probably is the context, something like that, where, people are turning away from him. So, whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. But then, of course, Matthew 26:23 says, he answered, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. And so that, of course, is his friend in the context of Judas is one of his disciples, right? Handpicked. Luke 22:47 through 48 says, while he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, right? But Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss, right? So you have Judas coming to him, and he betrays him with a kiss, right? Because that's the code for this is the guy, right? And so, again, you see that pointed back. Psalm 69, 21, it says, they gave me poison for food, and for my thirst, they gave me sour wine to drink, right? Psalm 69, 21, they gave me poison for food, and for my thirst, they gave me sour wine to drink. And then Matthew 27:34 says, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And so note, you have an allusion back there, but note that in this, you say, well, why are they doing that? What does this have to do with? It is very possible, or well, it's likely, I guess it's definitive, that this is a narcotic, right? And so what they're doing is they're offering Jesus a narcotic in order to dull the pain, right? But notice that Jesus refuses it. Now, I'm not saying he's making a comment on, drinking wine or narcotics or anything like that. But in other words, he chooses to go through the whole experience without taking this narcotic, which will then, dull the pain and dull his wits and all of that. So he goes through the whole deal. But out of the Psalms that they specified for this week, those are the ones that I chose to do, right? And so as we go through next week, again, it's heavily on the Psalms next week as well. I will do the same thing. I'll go through the ones that have, more important, looking forward to the New Testament period and Jesus, because I think that's important that we kind of look at that and kind of see how that works. And so, again, that's the focus. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.